Chapter 17, Mother Gets Her Own Way. Now the title of the chapter itself tells us that there's going to be some sort of significant change or alteration here, because as we know from the rest of the text, it's been very patriarchal in its focus. Whatever the father has wanted, the father has gotten. But here, we know that obviously something's going to differ. Something's going to be different in that regard. And it's quite obvious to us what that's going to be, because the mother's biggest crime has been that she's been in, at this place, she's been at Auschwitz with her children, and she hasn't wanted to be there. So we're going to assume that that's going to be the issue here. And of course, things sort of get more depressing for the mother in this chapter here, and that's when things change. All right. Where are we up to? This one here. We find out that there's this sort of screaming match and argument going on between the mother and the father, and we see how different their views are at this point. And you should go back and remember how well the mother supported the father's need to be here. She may not have agreed with it, but she didn't openly go against it. So we've got a very strong shift in the mother's point of view here. And she says things like, this is your assignment, not ours. You stay if you want to. Like, she's being very controlling, very demanding, very sort of firm in her beliefs there. And if the father is to allow this to happen, he's worried about what other people like Hitler will think of this, okay, if they sort of separate for this particular purpose. And I love this language here. If I permit you and the children to return to Berlin without me, they will ask questions about my commitment to the work here. And he uses the word, if I permit you, as if it's still up to him. And you get the feeling from this that the mother's going to go anyway. Okay, it's kind of a done and dusted deal for her. All right. And the mother's exasperation is captured really well in this quote here. Work, mother, shouted mother, you call this work. So she sees what's going on, and that's why she doesn't want her children to be around that. It's not work at all. It's the extermination of another race. It's the annihilation of a culture. So they can't really define that or call that work anymore. And Bruno reflects, obviously on his own world and what's going on there, and he's finding it harder to remember his life back in Berlin. He can't even remember the names of all his friends and things like that. And you would think that that would be something he would keep a connection to. And as things sort of progress and get worse and worse, he's worried about his mother, for she kept very quiet during the day and was having an awful lot more of her afternoon naps, some of them not even in the afternoon, but before lunch. And Bruno was worried for her health, because he'd never known anyone to need quite so many medicinal sherries. Now, it's a good example of irony there, isn't it? Because there's no such thing as a medicinal sherry. She's calling that so that she can justify drinking it herself. And this is throughout the day. So she's obviously so drunk in the middle of the day that she's practically passing out and having to sleep it off, and then perhaps continuing later in the day again. And it's interesting that he says Bruno was worried for her health, because he should be. Because if someone's drinking that much, they're going to kill themselves. And it's not just their physical health, but it's their mental health and all that sort of stuff as well. So Bruno doesn't get the severity of what's happening there, which fits in perfectly with his character. He's naive, he doesn't understand, but he makes some really important observations. Yep?
Do they talk about the mother as much during the end of the book? Like her killing herself?
No, it's she doesn't feature in it as much as what we should, and because Bruno's not focused on that stuff. Okay, it's even though it's not written from his perspective, it is third person. We still get the majority of the story from his. Sorry? Oh, not so much. When you think about it, after this, the story is that they're going to go back home to Berlin, and that's where Bruno dies before he gets there. So you can't really have too much of a focus on, after that on someone like their relationship, because it doesn't exist anymore. All right, so we continue through, and Bruno's worried about all these sorts of things. And eventually Bruno and Gretel get called into their father's office, and he sits them down very formally, like this is some sort of interview with the officers. They sit in the comfy chairs that they're not usually allowed to crawl all over, and he's talking to them. And he asks them if they're happy here. And of course they respond with what they think Father wants to hear initially. Yes, Father, of course, says Gretel. We know that's a complete and utter lie. It's not true at all. They hate it there. And Bruno chimes in, agreeing with her, and he prompts further. And then, of course, they sort of blurt it out. They can't hold it in anymore. They figure they've got an opportunity to tell the truth, and therefore they do. And Gretel says, well, I miss it terribly. Okay, she misses her friends and the life that they used to have. However, Bruno's kind of stuck because he's now made a new friend in Shmuel, and he knows that if he says, I hate it here, I want to go back, he's going to miss Shmuel. So it's a catch-22 for Bruno. He either goes back and tries to re-establish a connection with his old friends and his old life, or he stays here and maintains the connection that he's got with Shmuel, even though it's a different sort of relationship. Okay, and he's smart enough at this point to know that he can't mention directly what he's talking about. Oops. And he goes through and says, but I'd think I'd miss people no matter where I went, which makes no sense because according to his father and his sister, he's not met anyone, doesn't know anyone. And all the people that would go back to Berlin with them would be the people that he's sort of around now. So it doesn't quite make a lot of sense. And then the father asks it very bluntly, but would you like to go back to Berlin? And Bruno puts a caveat on it. He just says, only if it's all of us. I don't want us to break up. I don't want us to separate, which is a really nice sentiment. That's a really thoughtful thing for someone of his age to say. Okay. And then, of course, we know that that's not going to be the case, that it will be Mother, Gretel, and Bruno that return. And that's how it's sort of going to pan out. And that's where we've got this quote here. I'd prefer all four of us to stay together, he said reluctantly, including Gretel in that, whether that was in Berlin or out with. So very honest, very innocent, but sort of touching in terms of how he sort of values other people. And then the father goes through, well, for the moment, I'm afraid that's impossible, yada, yada, yada. And then he gets to the end. When I think about it, perhaps she's right. Perhaps this is not a place for children. And it's not really. It's a death camp. It's not the sort of place that you should be raising a young family. Okay. And then Bruno chimes in, so he's sort of relinquishing the fact that he knows a lot of information here. There are hundreds of children here, said Bruno, without really thinking about his words before saying them. They're only on the other side of the fence. What he doesn't get is those hundreds of children that are there are going to be exterminated shortly. He doesn't understand they're not there as his playmates. All right. So it continues and it continues and it continues, and Bruno has to sort of backpedal a little bit and just say, I've been watching. I can see them over there. I haven't been doing too much. I haven't been engaging. I haven't been particularly talking to Shmuel. So he has to sort of backpedal his way out of it a bit. And then the decision is finally made. And we have this paragraph that's highlighted here. And so the decision was made. Word was sent ahead that the house should be cleaned, the windows washed, the banister varnished, the linen pressed, the beds made, and Father announced that Mother, Gretel, and Bruno would be returning to Berlin within the week. So it's happening really, really quickly. And Bruno found that he was not looking forward to this as much as he would have expected, and he dreaded having to tell Shmuel the news. Okay, so there's a certain level of closure, of also grief that he's feeling, because he doesn't want to have to go through this again, just after he's forged such a good relationship.